You are live now, Efrain, so you can go.
Hello. Hi, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, colleagues. And I am delighted to welcome you to our last webinar of the Palme Foundation series. I am doing this on behalf of Winnie Byanyima. Uh, she is unfortunately unable to join this session herself. She is on duty travel and has had unexpected engagements this late evening for her in Bangkok. She was much looking forward to join you for the session and to moderate it. She has she has humbly asked me to do that, and I'm happy to do that on her behalf. So when I read out her initial statement and read I, please interpret that as Winnie's voice, even though our voices are quite different from each other's. So with thanks in particular to the Olof Palme International Center and to the International Trade Union ITUC and also to International Peace Bureau. Winnie, I was very glad to be asked to join the Common Security Commission established in 2021, together with trade unions, employers, civil society, and experts in disarmament, peace, and social justice from around the world. We intend to publish our report, the Commission, in April 2022 to mark the 40th anniversary of the Olof Palme Commission report, which gave us the concept of common security, more relevant today than ever. Our webinar today will dive into the Peace Dividend and what would be the best alternative use of the obscene amounts of money invested every year in all kinds of armament. Before moving to the conversation with our fabulous panelists today, let me, Winnie, share some introductory thoughts with you. My first thought comes back from the inspiring words of Martin Luther King back in 1964. Peace must be more than an absence of conflict. Peace must be the presence of justice. As we put the focus in the dimensions of military spending and the need for a radical change in the investment priorities of humanity, we have to reflect on those words to move in the right direction. The absence of justice undermines peace and creates the conditions for conflict. Winnie, am a long-time activist for social justice, and I'm incredibly concerned about the inequality crisis we're facing. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, be those individuals or companies, and the collusion between the interest of business and political power has resulted in the worst possible inequality crisis. The crisis was already there even before COVID-19 hit the world, and COVID-19 has magnified and exacerbated existing inequalities. Unequal patterns in wealth, income, access to health and education, and gender have widened further. Vaccine apartheid is a shocking reality, which rich countries flooded with vaccine doses, and the poorest lacking vaccines, just under 12% of Africa's population, is fully vaccinated today. As a result, the reopening of ordinary life and economic activity has been faster in richer countries and very slow for the rest. Africa has, in this respect, been acutely left behind. Meanwhile, the biggest billionaires have expanded their fortunes at an accelerated rate, while poverty, hunger, and gender-based violence have increased. Tackling the injustice of these extreme inequalities is part of the task of building justice and peace for future generations. Rather than protecting huge profits and political capture, enabling tax evasion and massive spending on the military, our global governance needs to ensure that we finance health, education, social protection, putting the rights of every human being first. This is the foundation of peaceful and just societies where everyone lives in dignity. Vaccines, universal health, universal public health care and education, and support for people's jobs and rights must be put before protecting excessive and undeserved profits for the few. Global governance must enable and ensure this is the direction we take so that we move to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and realize human rights. Inequality and man-made creation must be countered. Investing the peace dividends to correct the current status quo would be an important part of this overall transformation that is much needed. Before I introduce our fantastic panel, and I will do so subsequently, here are the two key questions for our dialogue before introducing our speakers. What could the money spent in unproductive military expenses be better spent on addressing the many challenges that we face? Inequality, climate change, poverty, pandemics. The list is long and getting longer. And secondly, how can we get from where we are now to where we want to be? Part of that is making sure people know what we could do with all that money to make our lives better. But we also need to look at how to convert the military sector in a socially just manner. The contributions from our excellent speakers and the contributions from our audience in their questions will inform the commissioners on these issues, and a report of today's event will be included in the final report of the Commission. Do please start asking your questions if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, and depending on how much time we have, I will ask the panelists those questions after they have spoken. Each of them will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and they will be introduced separately before they go live. And so should I start then by introducing Michael Broschka, who is Associate Senior Researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, who will outline just how much money is spent on weapons of war. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Ephraim, for introducing me. I have a small presentation, which I'll try to start now. I hope you can see it. So SIPRI is the institute in the world that probably has the best data on military expenditures. And I'll present some of the data to get us started on the discussion here. SIPRI doesn't collect data on all the aspects that are relevant to our today's discussion, but I think there is a lot of information you can find if you're interested on the website of SIPRI. I will focus today first on the general trend in global military spending, say a little bit about that, also on the top spenders. Then focus a bit on what we call the military burden, which is the share of military spending in national income, which gives an indication of the priority or the importance that's given to military spending within the overall economic wealth or poverty that a country has. I'll give some data, which is not actually SIPRI data, on what the money is spent on, and then again focus on a data set that SIPRI is producing on arms producers in order to address also a bit the questions that some of the listeners may have on what it means in terms of those people who are employed in the arms industry if we would reduce military spending, which of course would be a very important priority for the next years. So let me start with the trends and the top spenders. As you probably all know, we have had an upward trend in military spending since the beginning of the 1990s. After that, the increase in military spending from about 1,200 billion US dollars. It's always difficult to give these numbers because US dollars, of course, also have not had the same value all over the time, but SIPRI tries to convert it at some rate that is realistic. And it has been rising to about 2,000 billion US dollars globally in 2020. The trend seems to continue. We have only collected preliminary data, but it seems to continue also during last year, despite of the pandemic. Some people predicted that the pandemic would lead to a reduction in spending, but it hasn't happened. Top spender, of course, is the United States, followed by China, and then some other countries, India, Russia, United Kingdom, which are much smaller than the United States. Of course, big spenders are usually also big countries. So maybe it's more important than to look at the overall spending, the actual spending in terms of the military burden. So how much of what a country has in terms of its economy is spent on the military. And there you can see this is a map. Of course, many countries have different military burdens, but one can see here that there are some regions that have particularly large military burdens. For instance, the Middle East is a region with a lot of with high military burdens, while Europe is comparatively low. But of course, the current crisis may change that. Russia has a fairly high military burden, above 4%. The United States is very close to that, with also almost 4% of national income or gross national income in the share of military spending, gross national income, about 4%. Well, that's pretty high. If one then looks at other indicators that would be of interest, for instance, government spending, it's above 20% in some countries. It's close to 15% in a number of big countries. The United States is more than 10%. So, of course, it's important to have a view on what one wants to compare military spending with, and I'm sure that my fellow panelists will have some of their comparisons too. Here is just the overall burden in terms of the economy, which of course is serving a lot of other purposes and rather than only spend money on the military. So what is the money spent on? We don't have good data for many countries. A lot of countries don't publish details on their military spending. But for NATO countries, members of NATO, we have a bit of a breakdown. And you can see that about a quarter of the total spending is spent on equipment. So on weapons, on ammunition, and other things that are produced in factories. Almost half of the military spending is for personnel, for soldiers and civilian employees that are working for armed forces and defense ministries. The other spending is basically on training, on support of the armed forces, on infrastructure, buildings, and so forth. But it's, of course, important if one wants to talk about the peace dividend, that when we talk about the peace dividend in terms of money, most of it actually can be achieved by reducing the personnel of the armed forces. But of course, it's also the spending on equipment that is a large chunk, and where then we would have consequences if military spending would be reduced on people working in defense industries. And that's what I want to then focus on next. CIPRI produces lists of the largest arms producers in the world. And that's quite informative if one wants to talk about peace dividend in terms of what does it mean also for workers, for people employed in arms industries. You can see, hopefully from this list, which of course is very detailed, that we have a lot of companies that have a quite different perspective on arms production. These are the largest arms producers, but not all of them are actually mostly arms producers. A lot of them are, but not all of them. For some, the share of arms sales and total sales is very high, while for others, it is lower. And that is important if one wants to talk about economic conversion, which also is a topic that others in the panel will address. It's of course easier for companies that already have some civilian business and substantial civilian business to move into more civilian production than those that are completely dependent on arms production. Now, as you can also see from this list, you find companies from many countries, but most of the largest ones, and also further down the list, most of them are from the United States. The Chinese companies, and that's no surprise given the data on the military spending, where China is following the United States as number 2, also has a good number of companies here in the list, and there also is a few from Russia and Europe. Now, if one then counts this by country and adds up the sales of the top arms producers by country, You can see the dominance of the United States when it comes to weapons production. The same one could say for new technologies, the spending on research and development on new weapons. The United States is by far the leader in the world, followed by China. And then it's a bit different because European companies are larger in terms of their share in total global arms production than their share in military spending is. And that is that, of course, particularly European countries are exporting a lot. In the United States, the share of total production that goes to exports to other countries is about a quarter. In Europe, it's about half. So half of the arms production in Europe is not for armed forces in Europe, but for armed forces in other countries, Middle Eastern countries, African countries, Latin American countries, and so forth. That's something, of course, that links production in the north with the militaries and the militarization in the south. An issue I don't want to go in here now because of a lack of time, but of course also produces a lot of data on the arms sale. The final slide I wanted to present is on arms industry employment. This is not actually CIPRI data. It comes from a project that a number of people that also had links to CIPRI, not all of them, were involved in, where we had an overview over arms production in individual countries. And I just wanted to indicate that we have various tiers of arms industry producers, arms industry countries. We have a first tier, United States, China, North Korea, Russia, and North Korea. We don't have on our radar screens very often, but of course they have a very large arms industry, also have a very large army, where the employment figures are in the millions when one counts both direct and indirect employment. Direct employment in companies that sell to militaries, and indirect are those suppliers to these major companies. We have a second tier, which are major Western European countries, where employment is between 100,000 and 250,000. Then we have smaller producers from various parts of the world, and it goes down and down to countries that only have a very small arms industry. So overall, as I said, the employment in the arms industry is quite substantial, but one has to see that a lot of these are employment is in countries where arms production is not very important, where it is really a small part only of the overall economy. With that, I want to stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, for that comprehensive and insightful presentation, food for thought. And I'm happy to introduce now Mahmoud Moheldin. Hope I got that right. UN Special Envoy on Financing for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and an Executive Director of the IMF. Very happy to have you with us to speak about what could be done to promote the SDGs with the money saved by not spending it on weapons. Over to you, Mahmoud.
Right. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope that you can hear me well from I am now in New York, and I'm happy to share some reflections and thoughts after this compelling presentation by Michael and Cyprian. Many thanks as well to you, Ephraim, for sharing your thoughts and Winnie's guiding notes as well, which I very much agree with. I mean, we're witnessing great divergence globally and more unequal societies. In this compelling presentation by Michael, the figure 4% came several times in terms of spending on military equipments and defense and preparation for war. It's interesting, while I'm sharing these notes in front of the screen here, the talks about tension, the impact on markets, even the very specialized people in businesses, not in war and peace, are saying give peace a chance for our sake and the sake of the young generations to come. The 4% is exactly the gap that, if we believe the figures of OECD, when it comes to the SDGs, they are saying that we need $4.2 trillion in order to bridge the gap of SDG finance. Before COVID-19, the figure was around $2.4 trillion. After COVID-19, because of lack of resources and the need to spend more on recovery, the gap had widened to become 4.2 trillion. This is roughly 4% of global GDP, which stands today around $95 trillion. What I'd like to emphasize is the following, that regardless our specialization, whether in health issues or climate or dealing with prevention of debt or minimizing debt vulnerability, or dealing with cybersecurity, or dealing with the implications of COVID-19, these are basically the global risks that we are living in today. We shouldn't be forgetting that they are very much interconnected. And in order to deal with them, we need major funding. And without a need to overwhelm our budgets, roughly speaking, again, if we are taking the SDG agenda and the Paris Agreement seriously, we need really this kind of magnitude of funding for the developing economies. Again, the figure of $4.2 trillion to be bridged is critical. I'd like to say as well that the solutions for our current problems are available, as emphasized recently by the Secretary General. So we have sufficient diagnosis of the problems, and we have adequate solutions on how to deal with issues. And while we are seeing these big figures on spending, it is really saddening to see the World Health Organization is paying for a very small fraction to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. Only $22 trillion are needed for the ACT. $22 billion are needed for the ACT accelerator to help us dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Very small fraction of all of these figures floating around. In a world that, as seen by McKinsey recently, a world has never been wealthier, with the global balance sheet and net worth more than tripled between 2000 and 2020. Assets grew from 440 trillion, or roughly 13 times of the GDP, to around 1.5 thousand trillions in 2020. And the net worth grew from 160 trillion to 510 trillion. I mean, from all of this debate about billions to trillions that was there for the finance for development, we're only seeing trillions as costs, and we're not really seeing sufficient funding coming. We see how the world is struggling, for instance, with the $100 billion, which is a very small amount needed for the support of developing economy to deal with climate change challenges and requirements. Money is there, solutions are there, and we know how to bridge the gaps at the national, regional, or global levels, but very little is being done. And that's why you are seeing more people are falling into extreme poverty. This is the first time since 1998, 100 million people are thrown into extreme poverty. And I'm very much worried as well that the scarring is going to be with us from this crisis, health crisis, because we see as well a number of children pushed into learning poverty increasing by 17%. The figures coming from ILO about loss of jobs, 250 million people lost their jobs in 2020. And we see as well a bigger number of people suffering from malnutrition based on the recent figures coming from the World Food Program. So these are the facts. We have the solutions. What is missing is very much the political will. First, to stop war, win the peace, give peace a chance, and mobilize resources to where they are needed. And we don't need really to complicate matters. What is needed, the SDG framework is there. We need really to put that in global accelerator, and the Paris Agreement is part of the SDG framework. We shouldn't be forgetting ever that climate change is SDG 13. We cannot fix it without really putting it in that kind of framework. What is concerning us that while we have these kind of serious efforts by the UN system and the development finance leaders and many claims of doing the right thing, very little action is being happening. But meanwhile, what's really happening is accumulation of debt, the biggest accumulation of debt, what's called now by the World Bank the fourth wave of debt. Unfortunately, we saw the three previous waves of debts, each one of them ending with a crisis, big crisis, derailing the efforts towards achieving higher inclusive growth and development, including the one that we saw just in 2008. The efforts like by the G20 and the DSSI was very much welcome, but ended, unfortunately. This is basically the debt service suspension initiative that helped many low-income countries to deal with the immediate needs for support. But for some reason, the G20 decided to end this relief for low-income countries by the end of December last year. So we don't really have this kind of support. What is available today, and some people call it the only game in town, the common framework for debt treatment. This is again dedicated for low-income countries with debt challenges, but unfortunately this game is not properly installed. So I hope that the meetings in few days with the G20 ministers are going to be fixing that common framework, because it's essential to prevent debt, and if it happens, we need to deal with it before it gets into spillovers. And the SDR, the special drawing rights, very welcome development. The Secretary General had been calling for it. The IMF had delivered the figures, but they need to be rechanneled from the rich countries to the poorer countries. And we see many promises in that direction. What we need is really some good delivery on that front. So 3 areas of work. We need to work hard on the prevention, and that requires money. We need to work hard on the acceleration and getting us back into SDGs, and this requires huge funding. And the estimates, as I just shared, the 4.2 trillion needed to be bridged just for the developing economies. And we know that the climate agenda, we need serious funding, especially in issues related to adaptation that had been neglected and mitigation that needed to be provided. It's very much important to put that within the integrated national financial frameworks at the national level, and we need to accelerate the operationalization of the call for owning the common agenda as presented by the Secretary General of the United Nations, with its 12 main actions to help achieve the SDGs, including the promotion of a new decade for peace, including by strengthening international investments in prevention, putting women and girls at the center of security policy, creating a new global social contract anchored in human rights, including by creating a new era of universal social protection. And we have a very good proposal coming from the ILO on that front. Again, another accelerator is required for social protection and bolstering sustainable finance. Serious work is needed in the prevention. Serious work is needed for building back better by having a greener, more equal, and smarter world, and with emphasis on the impact on the labor market. And we need really to be prepared if all of that is not going to be delivered on time. We need to be able to support the social safety net and social protection. All of that requires funding, and all of what we need is just a fraction of what was mentioned earlier by Michael on what we're spending on war need really to be directed smartly to build back a better world. So here, the work is required. Lots of talk about pledges, claim to do the right thing, but very little on delivery here. We need to have a better connection from the financial and real economy with emphasis on social development and support of those who are vulnerable. So the issue here is basically getting the SDGs, the 2030 agenda right, and the Paris Agreement is very much in the forefront of all of that, with adequate finance coming from the public side, from partnership with the business sector, and good support with the civil society organization. We still have time to put matters on acceleration, but every day is a wasted day that's going to be increasing the cost of doing the right thing. So this is what I like to share with you at this stage. And thank you so much for the opportunity, and stay safe and stay in peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud, for that presentation. Very convincing about the investments on prevention acceleration that we should do. Thanks also for highlighting the debt crisis that we have, fourth generation looming, and also for narrowing down on the issue of a lack of political will. And I'm happy now to turn to Nis Coronacion, Deputy Secretary General of the Trade Union Confederation Central from the Philippines. She will speak about why working people and the poor generally in developing countries need less money spent on weapons of war and more on social justice. Over to you, Nisa.
Thank you, Ephraim. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm Nice Coronacion from Centro, a trade union center in the Philippines that embraces social movement unionism as a strategy for social transformation. Many concerns have been raised already. Of course, it is important that resources are allocated to basic social services like health, education, job creation, among others, rather than allocating billions to weapons of war. In the Philippines alone, the 2022 budget for national defense is $4.3 billion or 222 billion pesos. This is already around 4.4% of total government spending. While internal and external threats such as the maritime dispute with China are used to justify these expenses, it is clear for us that war and militarism will not resolve the present international tensions. Why resort to saber rattling when it is much effectively to settle differences through the institutions of international law? Even with the partial diversion of resources from the military to our country's pandemic response, this is only a temporary move, betraying a prioritization of the security forces over investment in public services. For example, Centro, together with the Nagkaisa Labor Coalition, developed a study on guaranteed jobs and the required government support to fund such a program. To provide jobs in the middle of a global emergency, the Philippine government needs 339.2 billion pesos. The allocation for new warships and missiles is a loss of 25% of the resources we need for guaranteed jobs. While it is clear for many of us in organized labor that international peace is a necessity, the crucial question is, how do we build a constituency for peace and democracy? How do we mobilize the necessary social power to force our governments to renounce war as an instrument of national policy? In a situation where the working class is decimated by a global pandemic, the jobs crisis is engendered, as well as worsening trade union repression like red tagging and killings, at a time when many people are angered by the aggressive expansionist policies of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly in the West Philippine Sea, which has stalked anti-Chinese sentiments. This question is unfortunately relegated to the backseat. Since 2016, we have seen how workers are susceptible to the populist illusions of demagogues and chauvinist nationalists. This begs the question, why are workers susceptible to these deceptions? The sad fact is, workers' political education has greatly weakened. Of our many problems with workers' organization and education, the most important is our failure to correct a long-standing problem: the lack of democratic political culture among the working class in our organizations. This fundamental problem manifests in different ways. While it is possible but nonetheless difficult to mobilize workers against repressive and dictatorial regimes, we find that most workers do not even question the everyday dictatorships in our workplaces. It is much more difficult to harness collective power against the idea of corporations and having bosses that it is to oppose despots and tyrants in governments. Clannish and regionalistic centered loyalties continue to undermine the power of democratic institutions. Familial and communal ties, while valid, often compromise norms and values in fragile democracies. Leadership oriented organizations, especially among the working class, continue to undermine attempts to promote democracy and empowerment from below. Rather than encourage workers to become masters of their own fate, they are taught to simply follow their leaders, experts, and the more knowledgeable. There remains a deep seated belief in the myth of a strong leader. Many workers continue to be enchanted with the image of the all powerful and macho leader that will solve all social ills. Confronting this democratic deficit must go hand in hand with addressing the root structural causes to conflict within and beyond states. Fortunately, there are many paths forward. For example, Centro is actively involved in the campaign that extended the transition period for the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, part of the broader movement for peace in the south of the country. We actively work with allied organizations and personalities to help us better understand the situation so we can address workers' issues in the region. However, aside from our affiliates and local unions, most of the Philippine labor movement remains unengaged in the issue of peace. Therefore, to successfully build a constituency for peace, we believe that the labor movement must engage in serious education work among our members about the value of democracy and its relation to the struggle for peace. Thank you and good day to everyone.
Thank you so much, Nisa, for your presentation and for pointing towards the need of the internal work ahead to get a stronger commitment of the labor movement in peace also in the Philippines. And with that, which is a way, of course, of mustering this political will that Mahmoud spoke about. And perhaps in the absence of political will, what do you do? And with that, I am happy to hand over to Hilary Wainwright. She's the author of the Lucas Plan, a new trade unionism in the making, and associate of the Transnational Institute and the Institute of Development Studies of Sussex University. She will speak to just conversion from military production to socially useful and environmentally sustainable production. Hilary, please.
Okay, am I on? Okay.
I think you're on.
Okay, so hi everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm speaking from London where it's lunchtime, but I haven't had lunch yet. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. And actually, Ephraim's right, I'm going to focus on what is to be done when there isn't the political will, because you can see in Britain now there is no political will whatsoever from either the Conservatives or, sadly, the Labour Party to address this question. But I want to congratulate the ITUC for such an important seminar and webinar for focusing on arms conversion at a time when actually it's sort of completely marginal. It's as if, you know, the military-industrial complex is no longer a real sort of danger, as if, you know, with the end, ambiguous though it was, of the Cold War, somehow that was the end of the military-industrial complex as a dynamic and dangerous force, and that now it's a mere sort of residue. But I think, in a way, the failure to dismantle the military capacity of particularly the US and the UK, but other countries too, including Russia, in a way, it is one of the most significant and dangerous subjects of silence in politics today. I mean, we can see it's a dangerous silence in the present danger of war in the Ukraine, which, okay, we know that the roots of the problem in the Ukraine are geopolitical, but actually the factors that turn those problems towards military solutions rather than diplomatic solutions is driven by the continuing momentum of the military-industrial complex, which is, as Michael described it, a vast machine in a way, both political and economic. There's some very good work, which I'll just jot in the chat, by Paul Rogers from the Peace Studies department at Bradford University, just documenting that, and particularly documenting, you know, the sort of role of the military in the present conflict in the Ukraine. I mean, I think also we've got to bear in mind the power of that machine in effectively and insidiously, not in a sort of conspiratorial, well, maybe, but mainly a sort of institutional way, making the dismantling of the Cold War machine, political, economic machine, impossible. I mean, we wouldn't have expected anything from perhaps conservative and Republican governments, but Labour and Democratic governments too failed to address this question. And therefore, it is necessary to look at actors, agents of change other than governments and political parties. And I think what we're talking about is how to replace a vested interest in war, which is what the military-industrial complex has, with a vested interest in peace, and thinking how that vested interest in peace can be mobilized. I mean, I'm thinking here of, in a way, the vested interest in peace that ordinary citizens have, including citizens as workers. And I want to revisit a moment when, in the late 70s, there was this awakening of citizens' awareness of the vested interests they had in peace, and particularly citizens who were also workers in the arms industry. I mean, there were a number. I wrote about the Lucas Aerospace alternative plan, but I also, before that, wrote about workers in Vickers, which is a very old armaments company in Britain with many different factories. And as I think it was Michael implied, or yeah, I think it was Michael, a lot of these companies, both Lucas and Vickers, are not just making arms. I mean, one of the workers at Vickers talked about how we kill people, heal them and file them. So they make both tanks, or they made tanks, they made medical equipment, and they made filing cabinets and office equipment. And similarly, Lucas Aerospace made kidney machines, as well as mainly making military equipment. So I wanted to very briefly tell the story of Lucas, which is a sort of exemplar, and then but refer to other cases, and then look at what made these cases possible, and then the situation now. So I hope I can do that in 10 minutes. Ephraim, just give me a nudge if I'm going on for too long. So the Lucas case, like many of the others, was a situation where the company, this was the late 70s, was beginning a process of rationalization, you know, under competition from particularly the sort of re-emerging German economy, manufacturing economy. British, rather complacent, sort of imperial influenced companies were beginning to be shaken up. And their first act was to start cutting labor. Cutting costs meant cutting labor. So there were threats of factory closures, you know, significant redundancies. And at many of these companies, particularly Lucas, this was a period of a strong grassroots shop floor trade union movement with a lot of confidence and self-confidence. I mean, a bit, perhaps in contrast to the description that Nice gave of the movement in the Philippines, there was a kind of a sense of dignity and rights which influenced their belief that redundancies were not necessary, that they had skills and capacities that were useful. And many of them had been influenced by the peace movement, because another factor obviously influencing workers is what's happening in the wider community, in the wider society, that it's really important not to separate kind of workers, the factory, from what's happening in wider society. That's relevant now when we think about the importance of the movement around climate change and how that influences workers thinking about their work. But just to finish the story on Lucas, so many of the workers at Lucas were members of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, were, wanting to do something useful with their lives, and increasingly believed that what they were doing, making missiles, was no longer useful. And then comes the announcement of redundancies, and they think, well, now is the time to look at what we could be doing. And the way they did it was particularly interesting and relates a lot to what Nice said very vividly and eloquently about the problem of a tradition of a sort of leadership consciousness. In Britain, it was a little bit leadership problems, but also slight, you could call it bureaucratic problems, where parts of the trade union movement have become rather distant from the shop floor, and trade union members no longer really had much trust or belief in their official leadership. So in Lucas, I think one of the key conditions for their alternative was that the workers there had come together as designers, draftsmen, skilled engineers, general workers. They were all in one organization, and they came together across factories, across the UK, into what was called a combine committee, a shop stewards combine committee, combining all these different groups of workers and different factories. But when they came together, the shop stewards had a very democratic ethos, that they couldn't take decisions and speak for the workers. They could discuss, they could arrive at recommendations, but it always had to go back to the workforce for agreement. And then when it came to thinking about alternatives, at first they did go to the experts, academic experts, but they wrote to about 180 of these academic experts, and only 4 replied with ideas. One of them co-authored the book on the Lucas Plan with me. And they decided, well, actually, the people that know, the people that have got a sense of the alternatives are our members. They're the people that design the products, that make the products. They've got an understanding. And their understanding isn't necessarily, as it were, scientific in the sense of being easily codified and written. It's what has been called tacit knowledge. It's practical knowledge. So the plan started from the presumption that the ideas, when they went back, they went to the members to get ideas. They did a questionnaire that was a kind of consciousness-raising exercise, a form of political education, as Nice says is so important. So asking people questions, which one of the workers said, we were asked questions that made us think we were planning. We've never done planning before. We've never had to think about the overall capacity of the company, our skills, how they could be used. And it was also made clear that the answers could be practical, could be actually demonstrating an alternative product, and they could draw on experiences from their own community. So equipment for disabled people, a very classic argument that was used by one of the Lucas designers is, we design mechanisms that can enable pilots to land blind, but yet, blind people are still kind of hobbling around with white sticks. Surely there must be a technology to meet the needs of blind people, as well as to meet the needs of aerospace. So there's all this thinking about how the existing technologies could be it's not a simple application. It often means a development, a modification to meet the needs, social needs. So they came up with about 150 products that addressed environmental needs, medical needs, transport needs, including a road rail vehicle that could move from the roads to the rails without having to build tunnels and completely change the terrain. So this was what they developed, which was in itself a very inspiring example, and inspired workers in other companies to do the same when they were faced with redundancies or when there were defense cuts. I mean, the tradition in the trade union movement had been, in the face of defense cuts, they would get on the train and go to London and argue, I went with the shop stewards I was working for in Vickers, and we sat in the defense department arguing for more tanks, for Christ's sake. But luckily, these same workers began to rethink and began to think about alternatives to tanks. So I could dwell on the stories from that period at great length, but I won't, because we need to move quickly on to the present situation. Now, clearly, the trade union movement is much less strong. There's a greater power on the part of management. And in the case of Lucas, in the end, management refused to negotiate over the alternative plan. In a way, management prerogative was more important than what the company could do for society. And that power, that corporate power, has grown considerably. So now, what do we have in I'm talking rather from the UK's perspective, though I always feel a bit kind of, I'd want to get beyond the UK, obviously, for obvious reasons, and think internationally, but just drawing from the lessons from the UK. An important development, which to me was very encouraging, was during the pandemic, where, again, just as in the 70s, the peace movement became a dominant, almost influencing the common sense of society. During the pandemic, and now, the issue of health and the well-being of everybody became a kind of common sense. Now, the government at one point, had been so badly prepared that it ran out of ventilators. So in a typical Boris Johnson fashion, he called on the great companies of Britain to make ventilators. But actually, the people that drove the process of increasing the production of ventilators and converting aerospace companies that were facing, a declining market into being the makers of ventilator parts were the trade union movement. So I interviewed workers in Airbus and found that they'd completely converted. They were very well organized. They had all this practical knowledge. They in a way knew almost better than management how the factory as a whole was organized. They brought together, like the Lucas Committee, all the different representatives, and they converted the factory into making ventilator parts. And that's a kind of experience which has been in the background of many workers in manufacturing. I'm now working with workers in Rolls-Royce who are being faced with redundancies, a bit similar to the Lucas Aerospace case. And they're saying, well, hang on a minute, we're skilled people, we can do many things. We were involved too in the making of ventilator parts. We should be they teamed up with green groups in their localities and discussing now how to make green wind turbines and gears for wind turbines instead of aerospace machinery, engineering equipment. And that's the kind of thing that's beginning to happen. I mean, I've been very encouraged by the fact that the green movement and the trade union movement are actually working together in many contexts. I don't want to exaggerate in saying this is the complete picture, but for example, at the COP26, where you could see corporate lobbies and governments really not taking the climate crisis seriously enough to come up with practical plans. There was a kind of alternative summit where there were whole panels on worker-led initiatives. The TUC, which normally is a rather conservative body, but now it's got some very imaginative environmental officers who are spreading this idea. And one of the biggest manufacturing unions, well, the biggest, I think I'd say, Unite, is similarly taking it very directly and spreading. It's got a transition task force which includes the education department, and it's making this a kind of priority issue for its members and its organization. So I think here we're beginning to see the possibility of the development of a vested interest in peace. I think now it's driven more by the climate crisis, but in a sense, I think we need to up the profile of arms conversion, because in a sense that's like a push away from the existing high carbon forms of production, and then the climate movement and the conversion in that direction is a positive vision for this sort of alternative. So I hope the fact that ITUC is
Thanks, Hillary.
on board is a
Yeah.
sign of a wider movement. Thanks.
Thank you, Hillary. Really appreciate your comments, and it's so exciting to hear about these the studies that you've done and your engagement with these, you could say, grassroots movements from within the arms industry of workers. Thanks for highlighting also nuclear, the potential in nuclear disarmament, and also the opportunities for the peace movement to team up with, for instance, the climate movement, which has such strength, also moving into the future. Whereas the peace movement might be, I'm not so sure it's that effective as it used to be in the past. Now, I am, before I turn it over to Owen and introduce him, I will encourage our participants, whether they are in whatever way they are sharing in this seminar, to paste comments or questions in the chat. And I'll try to relay them to the panelists in our Q&A that will follow after Owen. Owen Tudor, he is the Deputy Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC. Hi, Owen. And he will speak to how unions would like to see the current military spending redirected to a new social contract on education, health, climate change, and also investing in the care economy. Over to you, Tudor, Owen.
Thanks very much indeed, Ephraim, and thanks in particular notice to this role. I was particularly interested in Hillary's, partly in Hillary's description of the TUC, which was my former employer, as a conservative institution. There's no one as conservative as people who want to change the world. But I'm particularly interested in the way that the debate has moved on in some ways and not in others. We used to have a phrase which was beating swords into plowshares, about what you did to convert weapons into more useful machines. And I suspect, therefore, that what we've reached now is what Hillary was describing as converting weapons into wind farms, and that's essentially what we're talking about today. As Mahmoud said earlier, that the challenge now is really far greater than it was just 2 years ago, before the pandemic. We need to redirect military spending to a new social contract, in contrast to the crisis or the many crises that we've been facing. Now, that does, as Ephraim said, mean spending on education, on health, on tackling climate change, on investing in the care economy and in social protection, as Mahmoud also said. It's worth reflecting that those figures we were showed right at the beginning of this seminar by Michael shows that even if you just diverted the increase in military expenditure year by year at the moment, you could create a global floor for social protection that would help the least wealthy countries attain a level of decent provision for workers. That just if you diverted the increase in military expenditure. What we want to see is a new social contract that underpins common security, because obviously one of the reasons why we have such tension in the world is the lack of security, is the inequality that causes people to be nervous about their neighbours, to be worried about who's in the next door country, and so on. And we want to see common security, because everyone is more safe if the person next door is safe. You never achieve security by making your next door neighbor more insecure. We want a new social contract founded on good jobs and decent work, on equality and equity. And we also want to let working people apply the skills that Hilary was talking about, the skills that genuinely are deployed at the moment in manufacturing those weapons of war, to environment, to cleaning up, and coming up with clean energy solutions, new technology solutions to the problems that we face, and also on health. And I'm sure this is the sort of thing that that Winnie's staff will be worried about. We need better technology in the health field. We need new vaccines. We need more cures for the diseases that we already have. And we need to invest in better lives for people so that they don't develop those illnesses. There will be more pandemics. The one that we've just gone through in the last 2 years is not going to be the last of it. And we need basic preparedness to deal with those pandemics, especially pandemics caused by the climate changes that we've seen over the last few decades. And we need to put more money into education and research generally. As a human race, we need to become smarter about how we tackle the problems that people have. We want fundamentally to convert from wasting resources on weapons of war to putting money into a new social contract that would create a virtuous circle. It's not just about money, although that matters enormously, but we want a peace or common security dividend that goes far beyond mere money in making sure that we have a future as a human race. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Owen. Correct. This is a plowshare seminar, you could say, in many ways. And so for that very good presentation and food for thought, I think that carries us over to the question and answers. I myself started thinking about, are we using the right definitions of what is security and what the requests are from citizens across the world about how do we provide, invest, and spend for security. Climate security is probably one of those that people can associate today, but there are other parts as well to security. Let's see if we have some questions or comments in the chat. We'll deal with those first, and then we have some other questions prepared for you in case you as we wait for more contributions in the chat potentially. Maybe if I can start with a bit of a cross-cutting issue, I think it is. How do we, and maybe this can be directed to a couple of the panelists. I mean, if the issue is, and I'm a bit stuck with Mahmoud and your presentation, and the nailing down of political will maybe as the key to get this better investment of the money spent today on arms. I mean, how do we persuade global institutions as global citizens and national governments to abandon their addiction to military expenditure? That can have, I mean, I'm looking also at Nice and Hillary and their examples of trying to work from within or taking own initiatives, but potentially also how to create pressure. We are often looking at politics to how often they obey to good intentions and let those direct their actions, but how on occasions it seems that they respond better to pressure, including for instance, you mentioned Hillary, the cop, and I think there's no better example of the importance of creating pressure on politics and politicians. So how do we achieve that? I mean, from our different perspectives, would you want to have a go, Hillary? And maybe, I don't know if Nice and also Mahmoud would like to share perspectives on that.
I could begin. But I haven't got. We need a brainstorm really to come up with the best kind of example. But what I'm thinking about is we need the kind of thing that inspired the world, really, but then did create pressure on the institutions around what Greta Thunberg did. I mean, she just took immediate action. She just said, in a way, by not acting, we're complicit in the dynamic towards climate disaster. So she took her own action in her own life by striking from school. Another example about the military was in here, the UK, when cruise missiles were based in a part of Britain. Some housewives, not politically active women in Cardiff, quite a long way away from where the cruise missiles were, again decided, well, look, if we do nothing, we're letting it happen. So they marched to Greenham Common, and they what was called embraced the site. They marched around the site of the cruise missiles and built a movement that in the end led to those cruise missiles being abandoned. Now that's, in a way, we need an equivalent around the military industrial complex. And I think in a way, the Greta Thunberg was a strike that was inspiring. Greenham was like a movement. I think the opportunity in relation to swords into plowshares, as Owen put it, is that we have an agency in the workers that know how to do that conversion, that practically know how to take the technology, take their skills and convert them into peaceful, socially useful products, particularly environmentally sustainable products, and that transition to a low carbon economy. So if we can try and build on how we get exemplary cases that capture the imagination and then build the pressure on the politicians. I mean, we can't leave it to the politicians. That political will, I think, is going to come from the citizens and kind of embarrass the politicians to take action.
Mahmoud.
Right. Okay. So in this fast-changing world, we are witnessing a great deal of uncertainty, and there are two deficits. I spoke about the deficits on finance, but there is much more serious deficit, which is the deficit of trust. Trust in leadership, trust in institutions, be them local, national, or global, and trust of each other. And perhaps this has something to do with what Owen just mentioned about we cannot make ourselves secure if we are getting our neighbors worried about their future security. So there are two ways about that. Either to wait until a crisis happens, and this will really push for change, And as we have seen in wars, you go through the war and then you go and seek peace. You go into a financial crisis and then you see how to fix it. Or you go for leadership. And this leadership is not just about heads of state or heads of government or exceptional leaders like Mandela, but basically about leadership at all levels, local, national, and global. And Hillary just mentioned the case of Great and Her Generation in pushing the climate agenda. What's missing is two things here, that those leaders need to get their act together, not just in their areas of concern, which they have definitely need to be focusing on, those who are caring about human rights or issues related to climate or matters related to environment. They need to do the work fine as we do, and then with partnerships. The second thing is basically that, as I tried to mention earlier, all of these areas of risk are very much interconnected, and they are not going to be solved in their own right by just working in silos, assuming that fixing that problem will have positive spillovers on others. That these kinds of spillovers will not happen on its own. They need really to be created in the solution. So while we are trying to fix the health crisis, we need to do something with the rest of the human capital crisis in education. We need to do something with the deficit of digital access, because there is a great deal of digital divide. We need to do something as well in protecting the environment and climate. So I think the work is required here. Do more on the prevention. We don't need really to have more disasters. This seems very much like common sense, but sometimes we lack it. And actually many times we lack that. And then the second thing is basically trying to realize the dividends and merits of doing this kind of whole of society, whole of government, whole of global system kind of act, and build on what we have of an institution, and then try to build on some of the good successes that we have been having so far by doing the right thing, and to realize the benefits of doing the right thing. Again, I refer to two things here. The common agenda of the Secretary General that is now, actually I'm here in New York for discussions about it, is a good way to put us back on track to realize the benefits of this. And the good thing about it, it's not asking for new agreements, it's not asking for new deals, but basically implementing the deals that we have been all agreeing on, and push for the implementation with better data and evidence, with better finance and better implementation to build and building trust as much as we can.
Owen, you're nodding.
Can
Please.
I just pick up on that one? I think
Yeah.
I think Michael also wanted to come in on the issue of
Sure.
relative security, but just to dive in quickly on what Mahmoud said, I think the common agenda that the UN Secretary General has been putting forward is absolutely crucial as a way of dealing with these issues. We do need to build trust as well as building security and common security. As I said, they're both important. One of the critical ways, and this came out partly in what Hillary is saying and partly what Nice was saying as well, is we need to empower people as well. Too often, sort of great power rivalry is precisely that. It is the people at the top of society who are making those, who are involved in this. We'd like to see more of a people's multilateralism rather than just the engagement of states talking to each other. 40 years ago, when the struggle against nuclear weapons in Europe was at its peak, one of the key elements of that process was European nuclear disarmament, and that organization brought together people from at that time both sides of the Cold War. We live in a much more unfocused multipolar world now, so it needs to be quite different and probably regionally based. We want to make sure that the people are involved in that. If you take, I don't want to get too involved in the discussion of one particular crisis at the moment, but the Ukraine standoff at the moment, if you hear on those rare occasions that the journalists ask people in Ukraine who don't want war, and people in Russia who don't want war, and people anywhere who don't want war, you have to ask what the leaders of those countries are doing. Because if they were reflecting the views of their people, they would not be advocating any sort of military confrontation, and they might actually be able to find a solution to the problem that we're facing at the moment. So we want a people's multilateralism. We want to empower people to have more say, not just, as Hillary was saying, over the over the work that they do, but wider in society, over what society is actually, what countries are actually doing.
Couldn't agree more, Owen. I'll let Michael in, and then Nisa. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to pick up from Owen. I think one of the problems is that I think we in the panel here all agree that security is more than military security, that you need common security with potential opponents. You need security in daily life. You need security from threats of various kinds, including climate change and other environmental issues that are developing. So security is a broader concept if you think about it, if you think of it from the people's perspective. Unfortunately, security is still very much occupied as an idea, as a concept, by people who are linking it only to the military side. And some of these people are having a vested interest. Hillary mentioned that because they are maybe working in companies and don't have a clue how other jobs would be available for them. We have a lot of corruption in the military sector, but there is also, and I think we have to acknowledge it, a genuine fear as a source of the military spending that's exploited by those who have a vested interest. But we think we have to think about a gradual reduction of the fear of the other. That's very important. I think that's where the work of the Common Security Commission here is very important. And that has to be a gradual process. And the gradual process, I think, can be helped by many things. To build the political will to reduce military spending, I think, has many, many opportunities, all of which are important. Starting from the peace movement, going to willing governments, going to the initiatives that we can see in terms of saying that other issues are so important, we need more money for them, things that Mahmoud mentioned. We at CIPRI are working on a paper right now. I'm doing that together with two colleagues, where we stress human security as a core concept that might link together all these things. I mean, human security is a very vague concept in some sense. There's just been very recently a new discussion of it at UNDP of how to phrase it. Again, it's a vague concept that's admitted, but it's a concept that has the individual, the human being at its core. It says, okay, let's look what the human being needs in terms of security. That should be our priority, first priority. And then we can talk about other things. And maybe protection from violence is one of these needs. It's not only protection from hunger and protection from violence, but it's also protection from violence. So, and the funny thing about human security is, or the good thing, that it has been accepted in principle by the governments of the world. There are various UN General Assembly resolutions which say that human security is important and that the global world should invest in human security. Also, you'll find it in, of course, the UN Secretary General report, the Common Agenda, that was referred to. So, I mean, that's not the only way, but I think it's a good way to bring together this idea that security is not only military security, but also to take those fears serious that people have. And I mean, if you look at the current situation and around Ukraine, I mean, it's people there are afraid, but they should be given an opportunity to see that cooperation is much better than spending money to avoid these fears. So in order to get to a reduction in military spending, I think a process that starts with showing that less military is better for security is the core.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Nisa, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. I'm more particular in relation to political will. I believe political will requires public pressure. And if we want to build a public pressure, we need to have a critical mass. So, just like to reiterate my point that what we really need if we want to build constituency is that there's no shortcuts. We need to make sure that political education is embedded in the works of the union, especially for the working people. Because given the challenging times of pandemic, most of the unions are focused addressing their economic concerns. So if we don't mobilize them, if they don't understand the concerns of what's happening in the society, what's the threats of putting more resources to armaments rather than to basic services, then it will be hard for us to build that critical mass that will press for our concerns and demands, that divert those funds and resources that we can use for public services, for addressing climate change. So there's no shortcuts. We need to make sure that we are building unions, workers who are critical enough to address these concerns, because it's so hard to change the current context if we don't have people with us. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more, Nisa, with that. Colleagues, we're approaching the end of our seminar, but I was also thinking a bit about sort of the economics of and your presentation, Michael, and our discussion that we've had here. And is it, I mean, one opportunity for us is, of course, to create the political pressure. Is another opportunity to treat the arms industry like any other industry, because it's a bit like the carbon industry. It has a huge preferential treatment, right? Tax breaks, subsidies, trade promotions, etc. A lot of exceptions, that go for it, and it doesn't really have any internalization of the costs that it spills over on society. And I find that for climate action, if you don't have your finance minister and ministry with you, it will likely not succeed. Is there a case also for us to sort of just apply fundamentals on macro, on economic policy and governance also to arms, and come some way through that?
Yeah, if I can address that briefly. To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. To some extent, yes, because as you say, there is preferential treatment. There's a lot of corruption in the arms industry. I mean, it's one of the most corrupt-prone industries. On the other hand, if you let it go in free market, that will be even worse disaster than we have now, because we do need government control over these issues. But the government control, of course, has to be not guided by protecting this industry and giving it a special treatment, but by limiting its potential to the minimum that is really needed. And that's where the core is, in my view. I mean, the industry is a part of it, but the demand for the weapons that comes from whoever is in power is the cue. It's not the industry only that runs the show. It has a strong voice through lobbying and so. But in the end, I mean, you have governments deciding we want militaries, we want these weapons, and that has to be questioned.
That's it. Hillary.
It just occurred to me when Michael was speaking, and when you were talking about that preferential treatment. I mean, I'm wondering whether one could apply to the arms industry some of the policies of contract compliance, of using procurement and contracts to impose certain, as it were, society-wide conditions. So, one idea would be to require that in making a contract, a military contract with an arms company, there was a requirement on that company to submit alternative civilian products that could be made by the same technology, because that would then back up the search for diplomatic solutions. I mean, there's an excellent article in the International Peace Bureau's website by Joseph Gearson on the missed opportunities of diplomacy. Now, those missed opportunities, I'd argue, he wasn't addressing this, but are to do with the power of the military complex and the military industry. And if that industry was, weakened as a military industry without losing its manufacturing capacity, by being required always to have a civilian alternative, then that would reduce the sort of momentum towards war as a solution, as distinct from diplomacy. Anyway, it's just a thought.
It's interesting. It's exciting. Mahmoud, last words, and then I have to conclude.
All right. Very quickly, I think that our discussion today brought me back 30 years ago when my excellent professor of industrial economics was the same professor specializing in defense economics, advising NATO, Professor Keith Hartley of York University. And I think it's a three-stage scenario here. I think it's basically about realizing the gains of change. So people might be happy with the status quo. So, just as put forward by Michael in his very compelling presentation, is basically this is what you spend and this is what you can really gain if you do something better. And then the issues of complementarity and positive spillovers that were mentioned by Hillary could really be very much realized. And then you get these incentives, you get people, yeah, it's a good idea, what we can do about it. So perhaps issues that what were raised earlier by Owen and Nish about realizing these gains and operationalizing a new governance structure with accountability that's not just limited to traditional means, but getting the voice of the people really to guide us where we should be. Otherwise, we'll be continuing doing the same thing, working in circles without really moving forward. But I'm very much optimistic with the new generation and what they can really be doing better than our generation and the previous one.
Agree. Well, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation, hugely rich, and we're ever grateful to our panelists, but also to the people who work behind the scenes to make this happen, and to the people who asked questions, who joined us for the conversation and invested of their time to watch this webinar today or online thereafter. We will post this webinar online so that people can continue to refer to it, continue to learn from it, and share it with friends and colleagues. And as I mentioned at the outset of the seminar, we will produce a report for the Commission, and for the report, which is hoped to be launched by on 21st of April, and include its recommendations. But I hope on behalf of Winnie and also myself that today has helped to deepen our understanding on the opportunities that lie ahead of us, the choices, the incentives, the gains, and that we have identified what we could do with the trillions of dollars wasted on weapons every year, and how we can make sure that the money is devoted to the real challenges that people face. I think that most of the conversations actually point squarely back to political will and governments. And so I hope that we can all join hands and look forward to the report and the conclusions that we extrapolate from this webinar. Have a good day and stay healthy, everyone. And thanks again, in particular, to the panelists and to Olof Palme Institute, and also to ITUC and the International Peace Bureau. Thanks.